Hello everyone and welcome to today's learning session, Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Territories and Areas and the Link to REDD, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thank you as always for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns and I'm a manager for learning and communications. Our presenter today is Cristina Eghenter, the Social Development Deputy Director with WWF-Indonesia and Civil Society Stream Leader for the Borneo Programme. So before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips and reminders. Today's presentation is being recorded and you can access the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To find the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forestclimate and look for the REDD learning section. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers or you can dial in through the numbers that were provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this can often be caused by having multiple software applications open. So feel free to close some of your browser windows or your Skype and your email, and that usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join via phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send me or my colleague Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area if possible, and we'll try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit your questions for Christina or our colleague Minnie Dagawan, who is the WWF Forest and Climate Program Senior Advisor for Social Safeguards, who's also listening in on the session today. And you can submit your questions through the toolbar on your screen and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to the place on reddcommunity.org, which is our online REDD learning platform, where you can access a PDF copy of this presentation as well as a link to the recording of the session. So thank you again for joining us, and with that we'll get started. And I will turn it over to Christina. Christina, please go ahead.
Hi, hello, and good day. I guess I wasn't sure whether to say good morning or good evening because we are in different time zones, so good day should be like a good middle ground. Yes, thank you. I like to go briefly through the topics that I will be touching or discussing about, and hope your question will help elaborate more on the topics of ICCAs and rights and REDD. There are two parts. One is more about coming from WWF perspective, some update or some changes, some transformation ongoing in the WWF network vis-a-vis what do we do in terms of social equity, social development issues and rights. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, and then I'll dive into the ICCA work with, again, a perspective coming from Indonesia, working with WWF Indonesia that is not limited. It's just a good case study to see how we can promote and advocate for rights of indigenous people in REDD and conservation. So having said that, next. Hello? Oops. I don't know, for some reason. Okay, thank you, thank you. Social development and conservation, this is just sort of where we stand on these issues right now. I know for a lot of environmental conservation organizations this is still a big debate. There are questions, there are issues, there are efforts to find a win-win solution on this, and this has been going on for decades, not just now. But we do seem to come up with new approaches, and we seem to come up with more tools and more solutions to what is really a basic question of of environmental and social justice. We might take, this is the very simplified diagram to show how or where people stand. The symbol, the drawing in the middle tries to also strike a balance in between what is development and preserving the ecosystem and natural resources of our planet. And all this can be done through a good governance of these resources, discussions, negotiation, and coming together, all stakeholders, all right holders on use and preserve natural. For conservation organization, environmental organization is basically when we discuss and we aim and we have a strong goals about conservation, we also aware of the cost that conservation costs are being incurred by most likely marginal groups, out activities, and we have a conservation agenda in mind. Are we sure we are creating benefit for all those people who already are paying high cost for conservation? So this is the big question that is on everybody's mind when we address these issues, and we try to again find solutions and tools in order to address this. I just noted an opportunity for integral in terms of environment, social, economic, environmental aspects and dimensions of issues. It's really coming out strongly with the post-2015 agenda after the MDGs were criticized for not integrating or mainstreaming environmental concerns in fighting and eradicating poverty. And so with the new social development goals, this aspect, this approach hopefully is more on the mind of the people developing the goals, but it's also already in many of the mainstream, in many of the targets associated with the 14-something goals that are being developed. So having said that, the question comes back to the organization I work for, WWF, especially, and what do we do with WWF? We also had started asking this question for a long time, 10 years or so, or probably longer. But one of the things that we have, one of the ways we have mobilized ourselves has been to set up a network called, sorry, I realize there is no, it's an abbreviation only, SD4C, called, it stands for Social Development for Conservation, and it's a network of experts based in various offices and in various regions, WWF offices in various regions, Latin America, Europe, Asia Pacific, Africa, of course, and US. This is a way for us to come together. These are people with strong social science background or development background, but also conservationists who have come to appreciate the importance of addressing social context and social concerns if we really want to ensure sustainability in our approach and make conservation an appealing and a must-do for governments and other organizations and civil society, of course. So we work is in a way voluntary in the sense that we participate. It's additional commitment that we have as WWF staff across the network, but in this year. This has come more of a formal call, so we do have an action plan that is being endorsed. Some of the roles and function of SD4C is basically to mainstream WWF social policies and develop the social policies. Some of the SD4C has directly worked on and contributed to the one on conservation and indigenous people, on gender, poverty and conservation, and together with other organizations, particularly WWF US office, the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights. We do also organize trainings and workshops to build capacity and knowledge in offices on social issues. And we try to also work with offices on strategic plans and make sure that social concerns are integrated. It's not a question of whether to have a conservation target only, but to see that social aspects and conservation environmental aspects are addressed equally in our goals and in our agenda. An important part is also to reach out and not work alone or try to do everything, but reach out to other organizations, civil society organizations, CBO, in where we work, in our region, in our conservation landscapes, in our countries, to work together and shape together a conservation agenda for sustainable development. Some of us are also directly and intensively involved in global policy dialogues, CBD, mainly post-2015 agenda, World Park Congress coming up in Sydney, and some of us will be there. Yes, this is just to give an overview. And then I think the next slide is again on our commitment as a network with the endorsement of the Social Development Action Plan, which has 5 parts, but basically is a very strong vision. Social development is integral to WWF core conservation work. So the application of social policies safeguards and the integration of sustainable development, social equity in priority program and network policies. So here's the commitment, and the action has to follow. And SD4C for the network, WWF network, is sort of coordinating this effort. Now, when we talk about social issues, rights approach, and social equity, one interesting way to address, and one that is integral, particularly to the Indigenous People Rights agenda, is ICCAs. ICCA was given Indigenous people and community conserved territories and areas. I think this is the definition, or now agreed now. It started off with Indigenous community conserved areas. That's why ICCA, but then Indigenous territories, it was felt that they were not equally and explicitly included, so ICCA now covers more than the 4 letters say. It's an interesting concept, idea. It's something that exists, and only WWF and probably many other organizations just very recently realized the importance and the opportunity that ICCA presents for conservation, for the agenda of Indigenous people rights, but and for sustainable development. When we talk about modified ecosystem, where there is high biodiversity value and they're being conserved by Indigenous people or local communities for a long period of time, based on their customary regulations, customary governance, and usually these are based on collective rights. We are talking about commons, conservation commons, so to speak, in the indigenous territories, areas, and lands. There was an interesting document which I shared in the references at the end, which was prepared by the ICCA's consortium, which you probably know, some of you might know about, which is very active on promoting and advocating for ICCAs and documenting. So a lot of what I'm saying, a lot of the things that we do also within WWF-Indonesia is really aligned or inspired or based on the work and the tools and the thinking that the ICCA consortium has been able to mobilize and develop. The documents, again, some of you might have received it, might know about it, might have read. It's a very interesting document on how the contribution of CCAs to the strategic plan for biodiversity. And it was very good. You might know that CBD IC target 11, it was the previous slide, but it doesn't matter, keep it that way, it's okay. And target 11 as finally in Nagoya 2010, finally accommodated measures, other area-based, equitably and effectively managed areas. So that was the first time that it opened up to areas outside protected national park and other protected areas, to include the possibilities that community areas conserved by indigenous and local people could be counted, could contribute to the conservation targets of countries and nations. So this was a very important breakthrough, and is there in IC target CBD. But the document that I was talking about really refers to all the IC targets, 18, showing how local communities and indigenous people have indeed, with their practices, ways of lives, and traditional knowledge, have contributed to a great deal of all of the targets. Why do I say about ICCA is an opportunity and obligation? Because I think for conservation organization, environmental organization, something we can learn from and with. It's really an opportunity for us to expand the notion of conservation, to work in a more right-based approach towards our conservation targets, addressing critical issues of sustainability and respect of human rights, in particular of the indigenous peoples. That's why I call it an obligation. In general, there are different forms and aspects or shapes of ICCA, but there are three defining characteristics. One is the relation, people or a community, a group having a special connection, a special bond with the particular areas, because it could be their place of origin, because of some sacred or religious value, cultural value, for identity purposes, because they live from it, because it's a good source of livelihood, and so on. The management decisions, the governance is with the community, is with the traditional leadership, customary leadership. It is a system that has been evolved and developed by the communities and the groups and the people, and so it's based on traditional knowledge and experience and practices of the community. So they know best about their areas, they know best what's in it and how to use it, and how to also use it sustainably. And the third one is there is a conservation of results, because ultimately we're also talking about yet another way in which other groups, other people in their own ways contribute to the protection and the maintenance of our living, our Earth and our living planet. ICCA also, in another way, we could simply put it like this, three key components. You have the livelihood, so it's not conservation per se, or just no touch, no go area, prohibited exclusion, and so on, but this is about using an area, using resources, accessing an area in ways that are wise, sustainable, and ensure future use, which is normally the way in the indigenous people and local communities in their own territories and areas certainly do, because with an eye to the future and to the availability for the next generation is part of their livelihood. It's also important for the rights aspect of it, rights over tenure and rights over resources and land, and has, as we discussed earlier, a conservation component, a way to preserve resources and ecosystem services, and provide what is could be called environmental security for the group and in the area of origin or which they inhabit. It's also can be part of livelihood. I think it's also identity and feeling that, again, that connection and that bond with the place, with that particular place. So having said that, in terms of ICCA in general, a little story I have is about coming a little bit closer to the other big theme and the work that I understand all of you are most familiar with, which is REDD. Back in some years ago, about 5-6 years ago, when REDD work started to be big in Indonesia particularly, and consultants were coming out, big donors started to get interested, bilateral donors and so on. ICCA was not on their mind. Their mind was on big chunks of forest that could be, and finance mechanisms that could prevent deforestation, prevent these big chunks of forested landscape for being chopped down, for being and instead preserved for their services, particular carbon sequestration. In the beginning, that was very much on the mind of people coming out and introducing this new idea and this new thinking to communities, to government, local governments, and national governments. And then I remember discussing, this is really a personal experience with a consultant that come precisely for this issue out in Borneo, in the northern part of Indonesian Borneo or Kalimantan, and asking questions about who is this forest, who lives in this forest. So pointing out that all of that forest that he was looking at the map was actually indigenous territories, all of it. There wasn't a single piece that was not claimed in a customary way by indigenous communities groups in Borneo. So, and then I started talking about the existence of particular forest under tenure system and traditional practices of the Dayak people in the interior of Borneo, of preserving some specific areas, usually a tributary with the surrounding watershed, was preserved with particular regulations and permits, access was regulated very highly, and so on. So within the indigenous story, there was a particular area that was especially protected or conserved by indigenous peoples. So you can see the map is very clear in terms of colors and lines, but doesn't have any legend. I apologize for that. It's from a long time ago. But those blue areas, those are the areas that I'm talking about. Those are those ICCAs that local people had within their tenure natural resource systems. So the question by the consultant was very much, okay, but to work for REDD, you really need a big area. What are we talking about? How many thousand of hectares? Well, I said the size of these particular, these forested areas could vary from 2,000 hectares to over 15,000 hectares. But if you connect them up, and you can see that some of them are adjacent to each other, you can come up with a sizable area of forest. So in terms of your calculation, that could mean a lot. Besides, you are addressing issues of and have been managing and protecting this forest. So contributing by actively maintaining and preserving, contributing actively to avoiding deforestation and the destruction of the forest. You're also addressing sustainability issues because you're securing the livelihood of these people and this community, these groups. You are also addressing issue of legitimacy of a new intervention, call it REDD or whatever, that is coming in, and usually the difficult part of new ideas and new approaches is that of finding various stakeholders. And so in the end, to cut the long story short, that was the first time that this particular donor consultant started thinking about the possibility that could also be an agenda for ICCA in REDD work. And indeed what he called plus project. So one of the ways to do so. The next is a little bit of an update on how we in WWF-Indonesia, we are addressing the issue of ICCAs and REDD, but also other agendas that are important in this country, and how we do it together with other organizations, civil society organizations. So ICCAs in Indonesia is formed, is a loose working group. There is a voluntary coming together to discuss these issues, finding ways to fund common activities. But the important thing is we exist. We do have a platform. We do have a group. We do have someone coordinating. And the most important thing is we're coming together as CSO from a different perspective, some working directly on indigenous people's rights, others working on sustainable development issues, and then conservation organizations like WWF. We think that within the agenda of mapping community and indigenous people territories and forests, now after the court, I forgot, the Constitutional Court, yes, should be, not just the court, decision number 35, 2012 on customary forest, that customary forest is not state forest. That was an incredible breakthrough, but now the big work is documenting, mapping and documenting these forests. So we see ICCA as an integral part of mapping the territories of indigenous people and groups and communities throughout Indonesia. And with the awareness, with the understanding that there are major threats now more than ever, possibly to sort of disrupting the rights, but also the possibilities and the options for the future of indigenous communities and groups, with the big development plans coming in. And T3EI is the Indonesia Master Plan for Economic Acceleration and Expansion that is bringing food estates, huge plantations and so on to many parts of Indonesia, particularly in the east, like Papua, now under threat, but also other parts. So ICCA could also be seen as a contribution within the REDD agenda and an effort to build more sustainable development for the future as a way to achieve that. So I think I'll end there, and I'm sure there are things that are not so clear or I need questions and discussion. Happy to do so if I can. Thank you all.
Thank you, Christina. So at this point, we welcome your questions. So please use the question option on your toolbar to submit questions for Christina or for Minnie. And Christina, one of the first questions we have is if you can provide some more information on the Constitutional Court ruling on customary forests, which you mentioned in the previous slide. Can you give some background on what that is?
Yeah. Okay. It comes to. Oh, now I cannot think. Sorry, it's very late for me. I think of the word in English, it's a technical legal term, that the Indigenous People Organization of Indonesia, AMAN, had brought a case against a basic Forest Act, saying that it's based on the assumption that all forest, state forest, and community rights are within or need to be recognized within the state forest. So basically, and they won. The Constitutional Court agreed with their appeal. I am trying to remember the technical terms. If someone can help, or you, Breen, can help me, what it is. Try.
I don't have the technical terms, but that's okay. Keep going. It's useful.
Okay. I think it should be clear enough. Anyway, so it clearly says now that based on consideration of human rights, and particularly the right to food and livelihood, this was a major rationale, this was a major component in pushing the Constitutional Court to agree with the appeal, so to speak, and recognize that customary forest or indigenous people forest should not be part, are separate, are different from state forest. So is not state forest the big category and within which you can have customarily claimed forest, but is a different category. It falls under forest with rights, private rights.
Thank you.
So the other big category. Yeah, sorry about that.
No, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. So the next question is there any information about the differences in biodiversity between protected areas only versus ICCAs? So essentially, is there more biodiversity or a higher concentration of biodiversity in ICCAs versus protected areas in your experience or in your work?
I would only clarify that, first of all, protected areas tend to be a lot, or highest, we know that the highest biodiversity is normally in countries, areas, landscapes, regions that are claimed by indigenous people. That's a fact all over. Whether these areas are then protected by means of national parks or other formal ways of protection, that's a different story. But most of the time where you find highest biodiversity is in indigenous people's territories. And that's very true for areas like Borneo, for areas like Brazil, and other areas. So this is a fact. The other thing is that in terms of traditional knowledge, traditional practices, we know also that indigenous people are quite intervening to use resources in a way that doesn't destroy those resources, but actually allow for enrichment and for maintaining that biodiversity. So that is also part of why a lot of times ICCAs are areas of high biodiversity too.
Thank you. So the next question is, how are you measuring, or how can you measure sustainability within ICCA areas? How is it possible to track what, how people are working with diversity and conservation? So essentially, okay, is there a way that you're tracking the work?
Mm-hmm. In general, we have a historical evidence of this, because the territories, areas that we're talking about, and ICCAs within these larger indigenous territories, for example, or sometimes correspond to an entire indigenous group territory. Historically, they have had a constant rate of biodiversity and the forest cover. So you know that they've been able to use and live and their lives sustainably in those areas, because those areas are still there. That's usually what, when this is just an anecdote, but when you go into a community in the middle of Borneo, for example, and you start talking, oh, here's the national park, now your resources will be protected and the forest protected, the leaders usually look at you in sort of with a big question mark on their faces and say, well, I think we have done a pretty good job at preserving the forest. Look around you, it's still there, and the national park is just a newcomer. So, I mean, this is, of course, is a little bit exaggerated, but this is usually the kind of perspective that we have to keep in mind. I mean, the historical value and the longevity of these territories, forests and resources that we are looking at. The issue is when threats come in, when destruction and other unsustainable environmental resource exploitation comes in or comes next door, and when pushes and needs for development go unaddressed by the governments, and the private sector coming in and luring communities and groups into, you know, quick returns, much higher returns and so on, then the balance tips towards a different story, of course. And these are unfortunately not free choices. Sometimes these are forced. If they have free choices, then they can freely choose what's best for their territories and to continue their livelihoods.
Thank you. And so up next, I'm going to ask Minnie to expand a bit on the connections to ICCAs and REDD. And Minnie, go ahead. As you talk, I'm going to just flip through to the next slide here with some resources that Christina shared with us, and I'll leave those on the screen. So Minnie, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Bryn, and thanks, Christina. That was a very enlightening discussion on what are ICCAs. And I just wanted to put up the principles of WWF for working on REDD+, and they actually are very much in line with the ICCA, which is really the principle of sustainable forest conservation and sustainable use of the forest, which is, I think, one of the things that the ICCA is also promoting. Ensuring equitable sharing of benefits, which I think, I hope that all of us as conservationists would like to see. The other thing is on ensuring sustainable livelihoods and specifically for REDD+, the climate change mitigation. And I think that ICCAs can benefit from REDD+, because under REDD+, there are very strict monitoring requirements, and this goes to the question of how do we monitor the effectivity of ICCAs, and if they are also doing REDD+ under the ICCAs, and there are very strict rules on measuring not just carbon but also the biodiversity in these areas. So I think that by combining both, and of course with the free prior informed consent of the involved ICCPs, indigenous communities and peoples, then I think using REDD+ in the ICCAs is a strong, will strengthen the argument for really developing more ICCAs and putting more funds. And I was thinking that ICCAs is a much broader work, and REDD+ can be part of the ICCA work, and at the same time it can form part of the indigenous REDD actions, which we are also trying to develop indigenous REDD+ pilot area. So I think there's a very good marriage between ICCAs and REDD+ if we really work together and really discuss further. And for communities it might be less confusing if we don't come in with so many acronyms of ICCAs, REDD+, BAs, and so on, but it's really, I think the objectives are the same. So that's all that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Minnie. And Minnie, perhaps you can just very briefly talk about how you and Christina do work together, or how you have worked together in the past, so that our participants have a better understanding of that. Have you done workshops in the past, or what's the connection between you and Christina?
Right. Well, I'm part of the SD4C network for the Asia Pacific, and we have worked very closely with Christina, and I think it's 2 months ago that we had a joint workshop seminar on equitable benefit sharing. And so there was a mix of technical people and people who are doing social development work, and people who are doing REDD+ in some of the WWF country offices in the region. And we had a good sharing of experiences of how we have handled the issues of benefit sharing in the past. And the report of that will be coming up soon, and look up under the FCP for that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Minnie. So our next question, and this is for Christina, I think. Indigenous communities are not always the same. They're not homogeneous. Therefore, the idea of social equity will mean different things to different people within ICCA areas. How does WWF deal with this in their conservation work?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Reminds of a very important point. We should never assume that anything is homogeneous. Communities, of course, we are all aware of that. But we're also aware that things are changing. That's the other perspective, that are not homogeneous and they're dynamic, and things change. But as long as the commitment to preserving, conserving a particular area is there, and there is a consensus within the community, so there is a joining of different perspectives, but a common agreement on preserving that area and finding ways and working with partners who could be through REDD financing to preserve that area. I think this is good, and this is absolutely possible. What is key also here, in order to not get into the trap of the homogeneity, particularly when it comes to benefit sharing, equitable benefit sharing, is documentation and participation. Documentation is really in DOC, but also presently, and where going to where the actors and so on, and respecting local dynamics. Be transparent. Participation, be transparent, organizing meeting, establishing a relation, establishing a good bond of trust, not just with one leader, not just with a few people in the community, but with as many people, as many individual players, actors in that community, women and men, young generation and the older generation. This is very important, that this is something, we cannot rush into this. But I think with these two aspects, we can overcome possibility of find good solutions for social equity in ICCAs and indigenous territories.
Thank you. So the next question is that ICCAs remain unrecognized in many countries, and the lack of political and legal support often hampers community efforts at maintaining them through traditional ways. Is that something that WWF works with, Christina, or how does WWF approach that challenge?
Yeah, this is very true. I think this is also important to address this question, to look at this question differently, not again as a homogeneous WWF or network, particularly since you ask about WWF. We are at different levels of engagement in various offices. So, for example, and in various programs. So, as Minnie explained, in REDD, this is a given, and there is a definitive effort in recognizing ICCAs and indigenous forests and territory within the REDD mechanism and schemes. For us in WWF Indonesia, we do have, definitely in the new strategic plan, ICCAs are a big component, a part of our conservation targets in terms of advocating for the rights and engaging for best practices, supporting documentation and mapping. And I think other offices have also options to go into that direction. It's very much up to what is the conservation agenda in the various countries and regions. As for WWF Indonesia, definitely is there. But you also have a big job in terms of influencing or be part of mobilizing civil society, indigenous groups, and so on, and be part of this movement in trying to push for some reform and more tenure security for ICCAs. What I can say about Indonesia for ICCA in conservation, for example, there is now the law for conservation, biodiversity conservation in Indonesia is being revised. It is the process of being revised. I don't know what's going to happen with the new government and the new legislature in terms of how up it is on the agenda, but there is definitely a draft there, and ICCAs are being included for the first time as another means of conservation, area-based conservation outside protected areas. So it's a major step forward.
Thank you. And the next question, and as you answer this, I'm going to then advance the slide to show us some additional REDD resources here, but the question asks, besides the UNFCCC safeguards, there are various safeguards and standards associated with REDD+, such as World Bank and FCPF, UN REDD, voluntary projects, verified carbon standards, etc. Which of these safeguards and standards would WWF suggest are best to use for ICCAs, and are there any that WWF would not utilize for ICCAs? So again, this is maybe something that Minnie can chime in terms of safeguards for ICCAs. Minnie, do you want to chime in, perhaps? Or Christine? Let's see.
I thought that because it was on ICCAs that it would be Christina.
Well, perhaps you can both jump in on this one. Christina, do you have any thoughts on?
Me first. UNFCCs was mentioned first, so you go first.
No, I would think because the ICCAs are really created by communities that, you know, the safeguards are already inherent in the community. So I was thinking, why do we need outside safeguards when there are already internally within communities the safeguards are there? So that would be my general response, but I wonder if you have another one.
No, it sounds about right, because ICCA is not something that WWF or anybody external agent or organization creates, but it's something that is a practice, is a system that they have created, and we just give it a name so that indigenous groups and people and communities around the world can recognize themselves as doing a similar thing and promoting a similar agenda. So it's just a name that we give it to ICCAs. I think it's possibly confusing, but this is something that people in communities have been doing, for which they have standards in terms of regulations. They have standards in terms of values and so on. So I think that external safeguard can just help make us more aware of these, but also help respect and recognize and values and rights of these groups and communities related to their forests and territories.
Thank you. And this next question, I think, also actually leads right into this. And this is a higher level question. How are ICCAs created, and how can a new area be defined as a new ICCA? So you touched upon that a little bit, Christina, but would you mind giving a bit more information on that?
Yeah, again, I think that's instead of looking at it as created, is probably out of endogenous process of a community, of a group, and that they come to the realization that in order to preserve their own livelihoods and future sustainability, they have to have regulations about using particular resources and forest and land. So it's something that the communities have decided, that communities have come to the realization. It's not, and this should be very clear, it's not up to, again, I only talk about WWF saying, oh, let's create a new ICCA. What we can do is discussing with the communities whether they have a particular goal, a particular aspiration, a particular agenda for their forest that they want to protect, for that biodiversity, their own biodiversity that they want to preserve. They need help, they need support, they want to work with others. In which case, then we can start documenting together and possibly map and register these, but it's the local people, it's others. We can only facilitate and open the links or bridge. They can also register these areas and territories into an ICCA registry, which is kept and managed by the ICCA consortium. So there are tools out there that you can look up with more honorable and expert people than myself in the internet, but the ICCA consortium is certainly a great group, and really the spearheading ICCA advocacy in the world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That was a great way to wrap this up, and that's our last question for today because we've come to the end of our time here. So on your screen, you'll see just a few additional REDD resources, and we always welcome your inputs, and we hope you'll stay connected with us. Here's our Twitter handle, the webpage, and then the email address if you'd like to reach us. And so with that, I will bring us to a close, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I especially want to thank Christina and Minnie for joining us and presenting that great presentation. And I know that it is late for Minnie and Christina and probably for many of our attendees. So thank you again. And with that, I'll bring us to a close, and we will see you at our next learning session. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.